Stop broadcasting. Okay, I'm here. This hangout is live. I think I've got everything working. I have a stream. Let me see. I'm going to see if this is working here as well. Yay, I'm there. Okay, so I have the chat up. If you are in my class and you plan on getting extra credit, please make sure that you check in with me. You can also follow me. I'm typing this in on Twitter, and you can ask me questions there as well. That's at Merritt S Studies for Merritt Social Studies. So you can follow me, ask me questions there. You can post as well. But I'm here by myself according to this right now, but that's fine. You guys can go in and kind of rewind. I'm going to pull up my Twitter on my phone as well. So if you see me looking down, that's what I'm doing. Hi. Twitter. Yes, the tweets. So you can go ahead and tweet at me. I wanted to do kind of a recap. I realized I missed some stuff yesterday. It happens. Here's a rec. So I just want to kind of recap to kind of point out who's important. Some people had asked me again about presidents. So I am going to focus today mostly on the Cold War and modern presidents, but I am going to do a recap of some of the important presidents. Just so you know, and if you hear my notes, I'm sorry, I just want to make sure I don't forget anything like I did yesterday. So the first president you should make sure you know, obviously George Washington. You should make sure that you understand that he is he is the first president. He sets a number of precedents. So these are kind of these traditions for other people to follow. He is going to, have the 2 terms. I'm trying to lower my seat so I'm not like high up. Oh no, I'll figure this out eventually. He comes up with, the 2 terms, and then he steps down. This is going to be a practice that people are going to follow after him. He also comes up with the cabinet. Those are his advisors, people who will, act as major advisors for him to help him put our best foot forward. He also creates and establishes this idea of neutrality, not getting involved in any foreign conflicts. He pushes forth in his farewell address, this idea that we shouldn't make alliances. This will allow us to get situated and start out in this young kind of country, help get us out on the strong economic footing. He also warns about political parties, which obviously Hamilton and Jefferson don't follow. But those are some of the key things you should keep in mind for him. The next big president you want to keep in mind would be Thomas Jefferson. So he's going to come up for a couple of reasons. One, he is a strict constitutionalist. He believes that if it's not written in the Constitution, we should not do this. And he breaks with that when he authorizes the purchase of Louisiana. So he gets Louisiana territory. This is a loose interpretation of the Constitution, but it does double the side and help jumpstart our expansion in the United States. He also will come up because it is during his tenure that the Supreme Court case Marbury versus Madison takes place. It's the first time the Supreme Court declares a law unconstitutional. And like I said yesterday, and I say almost every day in classes comes up, Marbury versus Madison, judicial review. The judicial branch reviews laws to determine if they're constitutional or not. So you need to make sure you know those. The next president to focus on is James Monroe with his Monroe Doctrine. He tells the U.S. He tells Europe that the U.S. will stay out of the European affairs so long as they stay out of Western affairs. All these new nations in Latin America just gained independence. We do not want Great Britain or any other nation trying to influence again in that region. And then this will take us into Andrew Jackson, will be the next president that we spend quite a bit of time on. So he's really popular on the regions because of the spoils system. So I think to the victor goes the spoils. So this is a situation in which he will replace all those people, in these federal jobs that aren't elected with people who were loyal to him. People who help support him through his campaign are going to get these positions. He's also against the national bank established by Alexander Hamilton. And he gets rid of the national bank, which does cause some economic turmoil. He, most importantly, will probably be on the regions, though, for the Indian Removal Act. So the Indian Removal Act will lead to the Trail of Tears. The Supreme Court had ruled, in Worcester versus Georgia, that the Native Americans were a sovereign nation. They had a treaty, and American laws didn't apply to them. Jackson refused to uphold this, and he supports the Indian Removal Act. So that will force Native Americans off their land. The next president will bring us to Abraham Lincoln with the Civil War. And during that time, he is going to significantly increase his power as the president. And once again, we see during times of crisis, presidential power does expand. So he suspends habeas corpus so that they can indefinitely detain people who were sympathetic to the Confederacy. He silenced newspapers. He issues a draft to get soldiers for the war. He creates an income tax to pay for the war. He issues the Emancipation Proclamation. This Emancipation Proclamation frees slaves only in states that have rebelled against the United States. But this does show that this is a military strategy. The United States is now fighting not just to preserve the Union, but to free slaves. This is going to help the South lose the support of Great Britain and France, which is going to help the U.S. in the end. That then brings us to the next president you should really focus on, which is Theodore Roosevelt. And I actually kind of forgot like a key component of him yesterday, which is fine because that's why I have this. So Theodore Roosevelt, trust buster, conservationalist. He helps create national parks to conserve land. But what I left out is the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. So he takes that Monroe Doctrine and he adds to that, this concept of speak softly and carry a big stick. He's willing to use diplomacy. But when it comes to the Western Hemisphere, if Europe tries to interfere in Latin American issues, especially in the Caribbean, where the U.S. now has exerted control over Puerto Rico, and now we have this Panama Canal, and we're becoming imperialistic, Roosevelt is willing to use military force. And so that's his, big stick policy, his add-on to the Monroe Doctrine. I will use force to ensure that no other nation becomes dominant in the Caribbean. From that, we go on to other progressive presidents. So William Howard Taft, also a trust buster. And he is Republican like Theodore Roosevelt. But Roosevelt starts to kind of get upset with the Republican Party. And in the election, he decides to run against William Howard Taft on his Bull Moose party. This is a third party. And what we see is Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft are going to split the Republican vote. Together, combined, they got 60% of the vote. So had one of those Republicans run, the Republicans would have won the presidential election. But instead, they split the vote. And 40% of the vote goes to Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, and allows him to become president. And he is also a trust buster, also a progressive president. He is president when women get the right to vote through the 19th Amendment. But he is also president during World War I. And much like we see with Franklin Delano Roosevelt during World War I, he's going to be met with challenges. So both Woodrow Wilson in World War I and Franklin Delano Roosevelt in World War II are trying to remain neutral. They don't want to get pulled into the war. Ultimately, both get pulled into a world war. During this world war, they restrict civil liberties at home in the United States. Woodrow Wilson will restrict freedom of speech. We see how this plays out with the court case Schenck versus the U.S., where they establish this clear and present clause. If you are creating a situation in which it creates an unsafe situation, like yelling fire in the movie theater, you're not protected. That speech is not protected. And then we see with FDR during World War II with Japanese internment. He's violating the civil rights of these Japanese Americans and putting them into internment camps. Both after the war have these lofty goals to maintain world peace. So Wilson has his 14 points, and in that he calls for the League of Nations, Congress is concerned the League of Nations will pull the United States into more conflicts. They refuse to ratify the Treaty of Versailles, which would not only end the war, but create the League of Nations. So the U.S. never joins the League of Nations. It makes it extremely ineffective and leads us to World War II. At the end of World War II, FDR wants to join a peacekeeping organization, which becomes the United Nations, and we do. And since then, the United Nations, although some of their tactics have been controversial, have been this organization attempting to keep peace and maintain stability throughout the world. And then that brings us up now to the Cold War. So this is where I wanted to be today. Again, I have my notes. I posted these in Google Classroom. A lot of these, are very detailed, and I'm just kind of narrowing it down to some of those key points that you should know, and some of those things that you had asked me about. So let me get to my notes on the Cold War. So how this is going to go is I'm going to run through the Cold War, looking at the various presidents and how they are involved, key elements of the presidency during this conflict from the end of World War II till 1991. And then I'll kind of backtrack and look at the domestic angle, look at how these presidents impact the United States, okay? So let me see. Oh, I can trying to just figure out how all this works. Again, trying to figure this out. Next year, I'll have it down. And I'm going to apologize now if there's some background noise. We're moving desks around for Regents tomorrow. Okay, so the Cold War. So this is an era of conflict with the United States and the Soviet Union. The two of us have emerged after World War II as these massive superpowers, but there's political tension, military rivalry, and just this clash of ideology. The United States is capitalistic, they're democratic, they are against communism. We had already saw after World War I and the Red Scare, and like the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, that there is some distrust of communism in the U.S. There is this fear, and this is going to build following World War II. The Soviet Union, also known as Communist Russia, they're communists. We never directly fight the Soviet Union, but there's a lot of competition. There's a lot of what's called proxy wars or hotspots, where there will be conflicts in other nations that involve the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And there's a lot of times where there's this policy of brinkmanship, where we're on the brink of war, and the whole world holds their breath waiting for the Soviet Union and the U.S. to actually fight each other. World War II, Winston Churchill, the PM of Great Britain, gives a speech in which he makes a statement about the Iron Curtain. This is a symbolic wall that he uses to discuss this political division between Eastern Europe and Western Europe. So Eastern Europe are all these Eastern Soviet states, the Soviet bloc, and they are this buffer between Western Europe and Russia. Russia doesn't want to be invaded again like they saw by Hitler. They want this buffer zone to protect them. What Western European nation would be crazy enough to invade all of these European nations just to get to Russia? So this was, a move to protect the Soviet Union. And this Soviet bloc, creates this organization called the Warsaw Pact. And this is a military alliance. It's a collective security. The group works together to ensure their security. And this is very much a reaction to the United States and Western Europe's creation of NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Our very own collective security. The United States will work with North Atlantic areas, Western Europe, to protect ourselves, to prevent an invasion or another world war. But this is kind of the start where we start to see some of this build up. And the U.S. establishes this policy of containment. This idea that we are going to contain communism. We're not going to allow it to spread outside of Eastern Europe. And we will do anything to ensure that happens. But with this policy and containment, the US will be pulled into conflicts. We're going to see that we get into an arms race with the Soviet Union. We'll get into a space race with the Soviet Union, Russian to see who can get into space first. The Soviets launch Sputnik. The United States puts a man on the moon. But all this kind of just builds up. And what we see is because of these competitions, the United States and the Soviet Union start to build up their nuclear weapons. We want to make sure that we have this nuclear deterrent. I have more weapons than you. Okay, now you have to have more weapons than me, and back and forth, this arms race. But we are hoping that we'll get to a point where there'll be so many nuclear weapons, neither one of us will want to use them against each other because we'll destroy the whole world. And this is this idea of MAD, or mutually assured deterrence. We have the capability of destroying each other, we won't destroy each other. And this will continue on. What we see is there's also going to be various policies. We have the Truman Doctrine. We're going to contain communism by giving aid to Greece and Turkey. We want to help these nations rebuild. Marshall Plan. We are going to assist Europe by providing economic aid to prevent them from falling from communism. Eisenhower is going to expand upon this. Eisenhower Doctrine expands upon the Truman Doctrine. But all these doctrines and plans are essentially containment. We'll give you military aid, we'll give you economic aid, but we want to prevent communism from spreading, and we'll do what it takes. We see that one of the earliest conflicts, this kind of stare down, is going to be with this Berlin blockade. After World War II, Soviet forces cuts off Western Berlin from the Western world. And they're hoping that the US and their allies will back down. And for over a year, Western Berlin is completely blocked off. And the US responds through the Berlin airlift. The US will lift air supplies over this blockade and drop them to civilians. And this is a point where if any of those airplanes had been shot down, we probably would have gone straight into another world war. Ultimately, this kind of fails and the blockade is lifted, but Germany will not be reunited until the fall of the Soviet Union. Later on, we're going to see that the Berlin Wall, an actual physical wall, will be developed by the Soviet Union to prevent people from fleeing East Germany into West Germany. And this will stand as this symbol of Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe until its collapse much later. So during the Cold War, we see different periods of time where tensions increase and tensions decrease. And what we see is during this era of McCarthyism, Senator Joseph McCarthy starts what we call witch hunts, and they go after people in the United States they believe are communists. And this all begins with that Red Scare and kind of builds up. He's blaming and accusing Americans of being communists. He thinks that they've infiltrated the U.S. government, the military. They're going after actors, actresses, professors, and all these people have their lives ruined. They have to go in front of the House Un-American Committee. They have to testify. Some of these people are blacklisted, where their names are basically put on a list and they're ineligible for work. Some people are deported. Other people who leave the U.S. aren't allowed to come back. And what we see is this really affects a lot of people. One of the big cases we see is Alger Hiss and also the Rosenbergers. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg are going to be executed for being Soviet spies during the same era. But all of this is just showing how fearful Americans are of communism, of communist infiltration. They're convinced that communists are going to affect the entire way of life in America, and we need to prevent that. So what we see, though, are there some key kind of conflicts that take place where the U.S. and the Soviet Union actually are going to be involved in wars, but not directly against each other. So these are called proxy wars, or maybe hotspots, as you might have heard in global. So the first one is the Korean War. So the U.S. intervenes on behalf of South Korea. North Korea had started to become communist, and they are trying to make all of Korea communist. The U.S. supported South Korea along with the United Nations. Communist China and the Soviet Union will support North Korea. And the U.S. will intervene in this policy of containment to stop the spread of communism. It's the first time the UN is going to take military action to go against aggression. We see a lot of presidential wartime powers being expanded here. But in the end, communism will spread through North Korea, and they never reunite. Today, North Korea is still communist, South Korea democratic. North Korea suffers under their communist dictator. There's a lot of poverty and censorship still to this day. The other proxy war that the U.S. gets involved with is Vietnam. And Vietnam will have some severe consequences at home as well, which I'll talk about a little bit after we talk about the Cold War. I'll talk about the reaction domestically. So Vietnam War, again, northern Vietnam, very close to communist China. They become communist, led by Ho Chi Minh. They start to push their way south, trying to conquer all of Vietnam to make it fall to communism. And the U.S. under John F. Kennedy, also called JFK, has this idea of a domino theory. If you lined up dominoes in a row and you push one of them, all of them fall down. So the United States is convinced that with this domino theory, if one country in Southeast Asia falls to communism, the rest will fall as well. And we cannot allow that to happen. This is how we justified the Vietnam War. So the United States gets involved in this conflict, and over time it escalates. It becomes more and more of a U.S. involvement. So what we see is after JFK is assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson becomes president. As president, he is going to escalate. What we see is the Gulf of Tonkin resolution will be passed. There is an American warship that is attacked off the coast of North Vietnam. And Johnson uses this as an opportunity to get his wartime powers expanded. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution will allow the president all power necessary to use force in Vietnam. So this means that Johnson can send as many troops as he wants into Vietnam, and Congress has no say. It's very quickly that we see public opinion turn against this, and Congress starts to question whether or not this, unlimited power for the president should be stopped. The Wars Power Act will be passed under Nixon. This War Powers Act will overturn the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. It'll limit the presidential's powers in time of war. And what we see is if the president wants to send any troops into war, it has to be approved by Congress. If Congress doesn't approve it, those troops need to be removed within a certain period of time. So we start to see this rollback of presidential power in times of war because Vietnam had been so unpopular, and people started to get angry that more and more troops were being sent over there. Ultimately, the U.S. will pull out of Vietnam. Vietnam will fall to the communist leader, Ho Chi Minh, and it'll be reunited as a communist country. So when we talk about domestic issues following the Cold War, I'll get more into domestic reaction to Vietnam. So what we see, though, is there's a couple other conflicts besides the Korean War and besides the Vietnam War. During John F. Kennedy's term as president, there's what's known as very 13 tense days, and this is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba had fallen to communism under Fidel Castro, and when Castro took over, he started to go after people who supported the former regime, the Batista regime, which many saw as being very dictatorial. It limited a lot of rights for many of their citizens. And so people who had been loyal to the Batista or who were concerned that they might be targets of this new communist regime fled Cuba to the United States, many coming into Miami, Florida. Once there, the U.S. reached out to these Cuban refugees, these expatriates, and offered to train them. So the CIA trained these Cuban refugees and dropped them off in the Bay of Pigs. And this is what becomes known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. These men were supposed to get air support from the U.S. Ultimately, the U.S. does not keep up their end of the bargain, and it's a disaster. But what follows is the Cuban Missile Crisis. The United States is using new technology, new spy planes, and they fly over Cuba and notice new missile silos. The Soviets were putting missiles in Cuba in response to the United States putting missiles in Turkey. With US missiles in Turkey, we could reach all key strategic locations in the Soviet Union with nuclear warheads. So the Soviet Union felt to ensure this mutual destruction, they too needed missiles close to the United States. Cuba's 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So with having missiles in Cuba, the Soviet Union could hit all major cities of the United States with these warheads as well. The US responds to this with a threat to invade Cuba unless these missiles are removed. For about 13 days, JFK responds with the Soviet premier, the leader of the Soviet Union, back and forth. And the whole world holds its breath. This is probably the closest we've ever got to nuclear war. And in the end, Cuba will have an embargo created against them by the United States, which is why until recently you could not enter into Cuba or trade with Cuba from the United States. And the US will agree not to invade Cuba should the Soviets remove their missiles. The Soviets do, and unofficially the US removes their missiles from Turkey, and this ends the Cuban Missile Crisis. But for a while, the whole world and many people in the United States were fearful that nuclear war was going to break out at any moment. Okay. What we see, though, is during President Nixon's time, he's going to institute what becomes known as detente. So this is this attempt to ease tensions with the Soviet Union. Nixon pulls the U.S. out of Vietnam. He visits China to try to create better relations with communist China. And he also starts to work with the Soviet Union to try to ease tensions in this detente policy. And one of these agreements is the SALT talks, or the Strategic Arms Limitation talks. So this is part of this policy of detente. We, the United States, agreed to reduce nuclear weapons in addition to the Soviet Union doing the same. And this hopefully will bring down tensions overall. Ultimately, the Cold War will continue into the late 80s and early 90s. President Ronald Reagan will be one of the last major presidents during the Cold War. So Ronald Reagan kind of rolls back to temporarily. He is going to take a hard stance against Russia. He is famous for quoting, tear down this wall, talking about if you want peace talks, if you want to work with us, the Soviet Union, needs to take down the Berlin Wall. In the end, though, through increase in military spending in the U.S. and this arms race, the Soviet Union continues to build up their weapons as well, and it becomes a massive economic strain. What's ultimately going to happen is policies in the Soviet Union, such as Petroska and Glasnost, will lead to members of the Soviet Union questioning communist policy, demanding political reform, and after a series of push for independence of the Soviet states, the Soviet Union is extremely weakened and they collapse. In 1991, the Berlin Wall is torn down, and that last symbol of Soviet power has crumbled. Eastern Germany and Western Germany is reunited, and the Cold War officially comes to an end. That's obviously not every detail about the Cold War, but that kind of sums everything up, and I know a lot of you struggle with that, so I hope that helps a little bit. So what I'm going to do now is kind of roll back to talk about Vietnam a little bit and the domestic response to that. So I think, Vietnam War, comes from this era where music, the media, they're very focused on this. There's a lot of young people who were being drafted, and so people started to react to this. They're seeing the war on their TV screens. There's songs being written. There's demonstrations at Berkeley, at the Democratic National Convention. There's riots against the war. At Kent State, there's student protests. The National Guard is drawn in, and they open fire, killing 4 students. And this just kind of escalates some of the tension at home against the Vietnam War. People don't understand why we're there fighting while our young men are going over and dying. People who return suffer from PTSD. We don't really understand what PTSD at the time. We also hear about a number of terrible acts carried out by U.S. soldiers in Vietnam, which leads to people kind of turning against veterans. Veterans who return are struggling to find employment. Some of them are, have become physically or mentally handicapped because of their experience, and people just don't want to be there. And finally, Nixon pulls us out. But what we see is one of the big things that comes out of this is the 26th Amendment. There's so many young people across the country on college campuses protesting the war. The 26th Amendment will be pushed through. The voting age at the time had been 21, but a lot of these young anti-war protesters, these doves, these hippies, were under the age of 21. They couldn't vote. They didn't feel like they had a political voice. So the 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18 in an attempt to try to appease young voters, to try to get people, instead of protesting or starting riots, to vote instead, to try to enact change. And so that's kind of important here. But just to really recap again, communism, the Cold War, you have NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, Korean War, Vietnam War, Eisenhower Doctrine. These are all examples of our foreign policy and containment. It starts with Truman and it continues till the end of the Cold War. We want to contain communism. We do so with various degrees of success, but at a great cost, both monetarily and cost of lives. But all of this was all about limiting that spread of communism. So at the same time that the at the Cold War is going on, the civil rights movement is picking up again. We've seen different points of our history where different groups have lobbied for rights and they've gained some rights. So you see that following the Civil War, freed slaves gain a number of rights, only to see a lot of those get rolled back at the end of Reconstruction. Women as well campaigned for equal rights. They got the right to vote, but then, they never really got that equality socially or even economically. Yeah, during World War I, World War II, women got some jobs, but once soldiers returned, women were pushed back into the domestic sphere, the home as well. So during the 50s, we see the civil rights kind of blow up here. So it kind of all starts with this movement for African Americans. And some of the important things to understand and know from the civil rights movement would probably start with the Brown versus Board of Education. I always tell people, for the essays, for the thematic, make sure you know 2 Supreme Court cases well. And these are the 2 I always recommend: Brown versus Board of Education and Plessy versus Ferguson. You can use them for the Supreme Court essay, you can use them for a civil rights essay, and the 2 of them go together. So if you remember from early on, Plessy versus Ferguson, Plessy was I'm just checking to see if anyone's tweeting some questions, part Black man, refused to sit in the Jim Crow car on a train. And in the Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court rules that segregation was legal, provided it was separate but equal. Obviously, most of the facilities that were separate for Blacks or whites were not equal. And Brown versus Education comes up in the 1950s because a young girl, Linda Brown, had to be bused hours away from her home to go to the Black school for her community, where the white school was right around the corner. So her father sued the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, to allow her to go to the white school. This is taken all the way to the Supreme Court, where Justice Earl Warren, he is the other Supreme Court justice, you should remember, does a lot of these Supreme Court cases during the Civil Rights Movement, rules that separate is inherently unequal. If you're being separated based on the color of your skin or your religion or any other reason, this is automatically unequal and therefore unconstitutional. So this creates this push for integration of public schools. It overturns the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. So this is an example of how the Supreme Court overturns previous decisions and can interpret the Constitution, as society evolves. So this is going to take a long time, though. I always express in class that you can pass laws that ends segregation, that ends discrimination, but you're not going to change the way people think and feel. Racism is much harder to get rid of. And so even though the court ordered desegregation or for integration of the different races together, it's not going to be immediate. It's going to take time. And what we're going to see is a case in Little Rock, Arkansas, known as the Little Rock Nine. President Eisenhower actually has to send the National Guard in to force desegregation of schools. He is going to have to use the National Guard to protect these children as they go to school. And it's going to take a long time before there's full desegregation. You also might remember Martin Luther King Jr. and his I Have a Dream speech given at the March on Washington. You also have the Montgomery bus boycott, boycotting segregated buses in Montgomery, Alabama with Rosa Parks. Martin Luther King Jr. kind of leads the charge on that. They're using civil disobedience, these non-acts of violence. They go into restaurants and sit at counters only for whites to protest not being served. Freedom riders, people are bussed into these areas to protest unequal rights that are being experienced by different minorities. You have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 being passed in an effort to correct racial or gender discrimination, thereby ending Jim Crow laws. 1964. That's the year my mom was born. And yet here we have Jim Crow laws from after Reconstruction finally coming to an end. And Chief Justice Earl Warren oversees a lot of the court cases that are going to lead to these changes. You also see a Voting Rights Act of 1954 finally removing literacy tests as a requirement to vote to help ensure that African Americans in the United States can actually vote. This is going to re-inspire minority groups to fight for their rights. The women's liberation movement picks back up again. Betty Friedan is known for her book on the feminine mystique, talking about modern day feminism and struggles women experience. There's such a demand, social and economic equality. Even today, this is still an issue. You might hear about the glass ceiling. President Obama had signed the Lilly Ledbetter Act requiring equal pay for equal jobs for women. You have Latinos fighting for their rights. Cesar Chavez will help unite migrant workers and the United Farm Workers Union to demand that they have equal rights and protections. Native Americans will launch the American Indian movement again to try to gain protections and equal rights for them. Persons with disabilities who for years had been treated as secondary citizens, prevented from holding jobs, fired if they couldn't keep up. 1990, the American with Disabilities Act will be passed to protect persons with disabilities. You have to make accommodations to help these people. Even Fair Housing Act and Americans with Disabilities Act. Government makes an end to, tries to end discrimination against various groups when it comes to housing. You could have been denied housing if you were like a single mom, or maybe if you were Black or Latina, or maybe you had a disability. Now these all are protected. And this is all thanks to the civil rights movement that picks up in the 50s and continues. And even today, these groups still fight for equality. Today, we have other groups also entering in, such as the LGBTQ community coming in, starting to voice their opinions, starting to demand protections for them as well, and being met with various degrees of success. So now what I'm going to do is kind of run through presidents. We're going to start with John F. Kennedy, who was one of the first presidents, during the kind of what's called like the height of the Cold War, where we see a lot of these conflicts pick up. And then I'll go through modern day presidents. If I have time, I'll run through some Supreme Court cases, but there is Supreme Court case review posted in Google Classroom. So domestically, John F. Kennedy, or JFK, was kind of like this new breath of fresh air. He was young, charismatic. He had lofty goals for America. He wants to expand the U.S. space program. So he comes up with a new frontier. This is a reaction to the space race during the Cold War. He's determined to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Unfortunately, he doesn't live to see that, but in 1969, a man does land on the moon. And a lot of this is thanks to increased funding for space and math education. He creates the Peace Corps, where he is going to encourage young Americans to go into developing nations, to learn skills and help teach skills to these underdeveloped nations to help them develop areas and create access to clean water, education, and job training for people there. Once John F. Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas, Texas, Lyndon B. Johnson is going to take over. He was the vice president, and he takes it upon himself to carry forth the torch. He wants to continue with John F. Kennedy's programs, and he creates this idea of a great society. If America is a great society and we're wonderful, then everyone really should experience that. So he starts to create programs similar to the New Deal to help with the well-being of Americans. Things like, expanding Medicaid, food stamps, etc. Unfortunately, a lot of these government programs are going to lack funding because so much money is going into the Vietnam War. We're also going to see that during these late mid-60s, a number of civil rights cases for students and persons accused of crimes will come up. Again, Chief Justice Earl Warren is going to rule on Miranda versus Arizona, Mapp versus Ohio, Gideon versus Wainwright. These are all about the rights of the accused. You have a right to an attorney. If you can't afford one, one will be provided for you. You need to be told of your right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. That's what the Miranda rights. If you've ever seen 21 Jump Street, or God forbid you've been arrested, they read you those rights and you have protections. You have a protection that if any evidence that's found illegally, there's no search warrant, can't be used against you. These are protections for people accused of crimes that are going to be passed in the 60s during JFK and Lyndon B. Johnson's tenures as president. We also see that Tinker versus Des Moines and New Jersey versus TLO will both limit and protect students' rights. In school, students are to be protected. You have a right of freedom of speech. This includes symbolic speech within reason. We can prevent you from wearing shirts with, tobacco companies or drug and alcohol on them, but you can wear political shirts provided that they meet other guidelines. But New Jersey versus TLO, if the student's locker and book bag was searched, evidence found there could be used against them. So in that way, your civil liberties can't be restricted to a certain point. So those are two Supreme Court cases that come up. So we can limit your right to privacy, but at the same time, you do have some limits, some protections for your freedom of speech. The next president is President Nixon. And despite a lot of his progress in foreign policy, domestically, his record is kind of tarnished by this Watergate scandal. So if you've seen Forrest Gump, you see him call up and, he's staying across the street from the Watergate. He sees the flashlights. But what really happens is there is a break-in at the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. Nixon, as a Republican, is during his re-election campaign, and you have people break in to the Democratic National Committee to try to spy, to try to find out what the Democratic National Committee might be doing in this campaign to try to win against Nixon. Ultimately, Nixon has to resign the presidency. He was on the verge of being impeached and he would have been removed. So he resigns. This has a lasting effect. People lose trust in elected officials, especially the president. We start to distrust politicians in general. The Watergate investigation demonstrates the separation of powers does and can work effectively because Congress, the legislative branch, use its power to put the president on trial. That's the executive branch. It shows that the US laws are superior to the actions of the president. Nixon tries to use this idea of executive privilege. He's like, I don't have to turn over my secret tapes, the smoking gun tapes, that would incriminate him with this idea of executive privilege. Supreme Court rules, no, you need to turn those tapes over. So they limit executive privilege. Nixon was faced with impeachment, so he resigns. And ultimately, the executive privilege is weakened because of this Watergate. This Supreme Court case is known as the United States versus Nixon. And the Supreme Court directly limits the power of executive privilege for the president. Okay. Following Nixon's resignation, you have Gerald Ford, who's unique because he wasn't elected to the vice president or to the presidency. He got into these roles because other people had to resign in relationship to this Watergate scandal. He's controversial because one of his first actions is to pardon Nixon of all crimes. He was like, we need to move on, we need to heal, and so he pardons Nixon. Unfortunately, his presidency is marked by high inflation. The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, starts to increase oil prices, and this is going to really hurt the U.S. economy. So he doesn't create a bid for a presidency. The next president is Jimmy Carter. He wins the presidency. His goal is peace in the Middle East. He holds the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. He gets them to sign this peace agreement. It's the first time that Egypt, an Arab nation, recognizes Israel. If you remember from Global, there's a conflict with Israel and Palestine, and many Arab nations in the region back Palestine. But unfortunately, there's an oil embargo. So OPEC cuts drastically and refuse to trade oil with the United States. This causes massive inflation. Oil prices skyrocket. We have to ration oil. If you ask your parents who grew up in the 70s, they might remember lines of cars lined up to get fuel. Depending on the number of the last number of your license plate would determine if you could get gas on even days or odd days. And this really hurt his presidency. People really couldn't get beyond that. And then you have this Iranian hostage crisis. There's a revolution in Iran. They they become this Islamic Republic, and Iranian rebels seize the American embassy in Iran, capture and hold 66 U.S. hostages for over a year. 444 days, these people are held captive. They are U.S. citizens, they're diplomats, and Carter spent most of the rest of his presidency trying to free them. Iranians were angry with Carter. They're angry with him back in Israel during the Yom Kippur Wars, and they refused to negotiate with him. They absolutely refused to release these hostages while he was president. And it is not until the moment that Ronald Reagan is sworn in as president that those people are on a plane and take off and released to come to the United States. And this kind of makes Reagan an automatic hero for many who see him as influential in getting these people released. So Ronald Reagan is the 40th president. Domestically, he comes up with what becomes known as like Reaganomics. this trickle down policy. He believed that economic growth depended on increase in the amount of money or capital businesses had to invest in. So he's like, if we cut taxes for corporations, they'll have extra capital or money to invest in those corporations. They'll expand their business, they'll create new jobs, and then more people will be working, more people will have access to revenue. And so that wealth will trickle down to other people. He does support lowering taxes, and he does do this for personal and business income. He favors business or economic decisions that will favor big business, and he helps stimulate growth by providing incentives. Unfortunately, though, eventually, because of increased defense spending during the Cold War, taxes will be increased on certain levels of personal income. Reagan will also get involved in some conflicts during the Cold War as well. But some of the other things that we see is like in Nicaragua, there's a civil war, and he will back the Contras, this counter-revolutionary group. Sandistas were communists. They had taken over Nicaragua, and the Contras were trying to fight back, and the U.S. will help support that. Ultimately, though, Congress will kind of become weary of this and have to cut funding, but this will be tied into what becomes known as the Iran-Contra affair. To free the hostages in Lebanon, the U.S. sold weapons to a terrorist Iranian group that helped free these hostages. Money from selling these weapons to this Iranian terrorist group was then sent to the rebels, the Contras, to help overthrow the Sandistas in Nicaragua. It becomes really messy. Ronald Reagan maintains he had no idea this illegal move was being done, so he was kind of excluded from that. But many people in his administration had to step down and got into a lot of trouble. But people, again, start to distrust the government. Like, what are we doing here? We're having these secret deals, illegal deals. We're giving weapons to terrorists and using that money to fund other, anti-revolutionary groups. So it's all kind of, weird. But Reagan, for many, is a hero. Others don't like him, but we do see some economic growth. For businesses, we do see the Berlin Wall collapse and communism, come to an end. He's like, Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And for many, they love him. Others, not so much. They feel like he didn't do enough to really help the economy that had massive inflation stemming from the OPEC oil embargo and some of those economic crises in the 70s. In the late 80s, early 90s, we get President George H.W. Bush. So this is the first one. And he promises no new taxes. But his presidency will kind of be marred by this conflict in the Persian Gulf. This is known as the Persian Gulf War. And what we see is Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, who has a lot of oil. And we get involved to try to free Kuwait from this Iraqi control. We see that we are trying to keep oil coming into the U.S. We're one of the largest consumers of oil, and we need this. We never officially declare war. It's kind of like another UN conflict like Korea. U.S. forces with United Nations forces are involved. Saddam Hussein signs a ceasefire agreement, and it's not until we get back involved with Iraq with George W. Bush that Saddam Hussein finally will, to many, be brought to justice, but ultimately be removed from power. In the end, Saddam Hussein remains in power in Iraq, but Kuwait is freed, and the Persian Gulf War comes to an end. Then we enter William Bill Clinton. And he tries to do a number of reforms. He also adopts some traditional Republican policies, but he really tries to push for healthcare reform. They want to ensure healthcare for all Americans. This isn't something new that Obama came up with. This is something that had been debated for a while. Ultimately, though, this fails. Social Security starts to become a concern. We're starting to enter this era where the baby boom generation following World War II is starting to age. They're starting to retire. And we're starting to notice that eventually more people are going to be taken from Social Security than put in, which could create an economic problem for Social Security. And this needs to be dealt with. But we do see that during the Clinton years, there's a balanced budget. It's the first in about 25 years. There's a lot of economic growth. Some of this is from what's called the dot-com bubble. So during the dot-com bubble, the internet has taken off. All these new internet businesses are creating a lot of revenue, a lot of tax money, and it just kind of blows up. But his presidency is going to be marred by scandal, much like Nixon. While president, he has an affair with a White House intern called Monica Lewinsky. He is asked about it and is accused of lying under oath. So he is put on trial for perjury and obstruction of justice. He is brought on impeachment charges, but he is not found guilty and he is not removed from office. The other president that had been brought up on impeachment charges but not removed from office is Andrew Johnson during Reconstruction. Bill Clinton, fight for human rights in foreign nations such as Kosovo, Bosnia, Somalia. He sends U.S. troops along with UN troops into these regions to try to prevent ethnic cleansing and some civil war. But really, when people think about Bill Clinton, the thing that comes to mind first is this impeachment process over, this relationship with Monica Lewinsky. Following Bill Clinton, actually, before I move from Bill Clinton, economically, he also signs into law NAFTA. You might have heard the president currently talking about NAFTA and wanting to renegotiate this. This is the North American Free Trade Organization. Free Trade Agreement. So this is an agreement between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. And the idea was to end tariffs, so eliminate taxes on imported goods, to encourage trade between these three nations. For many, they criticize this, saying that we have lost jobs to Mexico. We do see that this reflects the U.S. commitment to globalization. And while some jobs have gone to Mexico, we have increased trade. And a lot of jobs have, not necessarily left from Mexico, but have changed because a lot of our industries are turned into machines, which can create cars or textiles faster. Yep, and hopefully back. Yay, I'm back. So more efficient than humans can. Then we entered George W. Bush in 2001. And early in his presidency, September 11th takes place, which is attack on the Trade Center by terrorists. And he makes a commitment to this war on terror. This brings us into Afghanistan. We removed the Taliban from power because they were known for allowing terrorists such as Al-Qaeda to operate and train military forces. We also enter Iraq. Initially, we were pursuing this incorrect information that they had weapons of mass destruction. They did not in the end, but we do remove Saddam Hussein from power finally. And this will continue to be a conflict, this issue, this war on terror that the United States continues to struggle with even today. In 2008, we enter in what becomes known as the Great Recession. There's a massive housing crisis. Banks had made a series of loans that could not be repaid by homeowners. Massive foreclosures were leading to possible bankruptcy for a number of very large banks. And what we see is that President Bush will create a bank bailout. These banks were too big to fail. And we are trying to prevent them from going under and creating a complete collapse of the U.S. economy. This Great Recession will continue. We are now officially out of the recession. Unemployment is at levels deemed appropriate for a capitalist society today. But even today, if you look around, you can still see people struggling to come out of that economic, recession. There's still people who have, been unable to find new employment. Lots of people underemployed. Maybe they have degrees, but they're working jobs that don't require degrees, so they're getting paid low wages. Still homes that are being foreclosed on, and banks trying to restructure and deal with that. And the last president I'm going to talk about is President Obama. President Trump is still new in his presidency, so he most likely won't be on the regions, but Obama has and most likely will show up on the regions. So obviously he is known because he is the first Black president, but what really is focused on here is some of the legislation that he is going to focus on during his presidency. So the first, which I've already mentioned, is the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. On average, women earn 70 cents for every dollar that a man earns in the same field. So with this act, they create this policy that there's no statute of limitations on pay for employment discrimination, which means that at any point in your career, had you been discriminated on because of your gender and you didn't get paid the same amount as someone doing the same job with the same qualifications, you can get back pay for that. It also will allow people to file these discrimination lawsuits. It's the very first bill he signed as president. And then, of course, the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare, which is highly controversial and misunderstood. This is not an insurance plan. This is an act of Congress. So this was created and signed into law, and it's legislation to regulate insurance companies. There is an individual mandate that required everyone to have insurance or pay a small fine. It required that insurance companies cover previous diagnosed conditions. They have to cover contraceptives and certain other procedures like well care visits, like your physicals. But all of this was controversial, and since it's been signed into law, there has been numerous attempts to repeal it or to change it. And right now, that is on the Trump agenda for one of their main focal points. We also see that there's an auto bailout stemming from that Great Recession. GM, Ford, Chrysler will be given loans from the U.S. taxpayers to help them restructure their companies and prevent these great American enterprises from going under. They recovered and paid back that money. And many people herald this as a moment where the American auto industry was saved. The war in Iraq was ended. There's plans to remove our troops. Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, who was responsible for 9/11, was eliminated as well. So despite controversies, Obama had made a number of changes that could show up on the regions. So just a quick recap. Please pay attention to these ideas that in times of crisis, civil liberties are suspended. One of the last ones that I forgot to mention is following 9/11, the passage of the Patriot Act. We looked at this in class. So this Patriot Act allows the NSA and other organizations to essentially spy on people they believe to be associated with terrorism. But this Patriot Act is controversial because it does blur those lines between our rights as American citizens and limitations on that to prevent terrorism. So just remember, in times of crisis, civil liberties are suspended. So key ones to think about would be habeas corpus during the Civil War by Abraham Lincoln, or your freedom of speech with the Espionage Act during World War I by Woodrow Wilson. And that's going to play out in the Supreme Court case Schenck versus the U.S. You'll also see that with FDR in World War II with Japanese internment, which becomes a focal point of Korematsu versus the U.S., in which the Supreme Court rules that it was constitutional and okay in times of war to detain these people. It's not until the 1980s that Korematsu versus the U.S. will be overturned and deemed Japanese internment deemed wrong. We apologize for it, and survivors of Japanese internment will be given $20,000 apiece in reparations. Then, of course, in following 9/11, the Patriot Act also could be seen where civil liberties are suspended. During westward expansion, keep in mind, westward expansion brings people from the north and the south into the west. This will increase sectional tensions because now these differences in opinions on states' rights, federal power, slavery are going to kind of come, to a head in the West. And then, of course, foreign policy is, this very crucial or important aspect to president's time in office. It can determine American safeties. It can promote specific agendas like containment, or it could help us economically, like we see with trying to maintain peace in the Middle East. Jimmy Carter wants peace in the Middle East because of OPEC. Those Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Most of them are in the Middle East. If they're at war, they're not going to be producing oil at the same rate, or they might charge more. So that could affect us economically as well. So these are things that you should keep in mind. Hopefully, I'm not missing any questions. I'm going to try to really quick, I'm going to check my Twitter feed to make sure no one tweeted out a question either. And I'm going to run through, I know some of you guys had some questions for me on Supreme Court cases. So in Google Classroom, I had posted a rundown. I'm back. Okay, so I just have some buffering here. So I had people ask me questions about the Supreme Court cases. So I'm going to look at Supreme Court cases and kind of give you a rundown of key ones to really look at. Again, focus on the importance. Focus on what impact they've had, okay? So once this loads up, I'll continue to give you kind of a little bit of background. I don't think anyone has any questions right now. I see one person's with me. Hi, one person. Make sure if you're watching this for extra credit, you let me know that you did this. You could just post some comments in Google Classroom on the video. If you have any questions, ask questions there, and I can try to answer them tonight. I also want to remind you that Keith Hughes of Hip Hughes Histories around 8 o'clock tonight is going to have another live broadcast. Way better than me, way more experience, probably won't have buffering issues, and you can check that out. And so the first Supreme Court case that you should know, Marbury versus Madison. Again, know the importance. Chief Justice John Marshall is going to address Marbury versus Madison. He's going to rule that the Supreme Court doesn't have enough power to basically, force, this, order to be delivered. They ruled that, this judicial act that would allow them to do this is unconstitutional. That establishes judicial review. So remember, Marbury versus Madison, judicial review, John Marshall. The Supreme Court reviews laws to determine if they're unconstitutional or not. So judicial review, judicial branch reviews laws. Another Supreme Court case, McCulloch versus Maryland. This is this idea of federalism, state versus federal power. Who's supreme? The federal government, not the states. So what we see is that, again, the national bank is very controversial. In Maryland, there's an attempt to tax the national bank. Supreme Court rules Maryland does not have the power to tax the national bank. It's a national bank, not a state bank. Therefore, the state doesn't have any power over it. So again, McCulloch versus Maryland, federal power is supreme, not the states. Maryland does not have the power to tax the national bank. Gibson versus Ogden, this is the steamship case. So this is that ferry between New York and New Jersey. John Marshall, again, rules the federal government regulates trade between the states. This is interstate trade. New York cannot create a monopoly. If this steamship went straight up the Hudson in New York, they could do that. But between New York and New Jersey, that is a federal issue. Therefore, again, federal government reigns supreme. They regulate interstate trade. And that was Gibson versus Ogden. Worcester versus Georgia, often linked to Cherokee versus Georgia. Also, this is all about Native Americans. Cherokee versus Georgia, Supreme Court says the Cherokee are a sovereign nation. They are their own nation within the United States, but U.S. laws don't apply to them. Worcester versus Georgia, they say treaties between the U.S. government and the Indian nations are the supreme law of the land. They can't be overruled by an act of Congress or by a state law. This basically says that the Indian Removal Act would be unconstitutional. And Andrew Jackson at the time, very much supportive of Indian removal, says, well, you made your decision, enforce it. It is not the job of the judicial branch to enforce their law. Judicial branch's job is to interpret the law. The executive, in this case, Andrew Jackson, should be enforcing it. And since he refused, he supported Georgia in defying this ruling. Native Americans are going to be removed through the Indian Removal Act, and this will lead to the Trail of Tears. Dred Scott versus Sanford. This is the one. Dred Scott was a slave. He sued for freedom when he was taken to a free state. Supreme Court says, Scott, you are a slave. You are property. You are not a U.S. citizen. Therefore, you cannot sue. They also ruled that the Missouri Compromise, which had banned slavery north of the 3630 line, was unconstitutional. Congress, they maintain, cannot make laws about slavery. You can't ban slavery in these territories. Therefore, Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. Slaves are property, not citizens. This is going to greatly benefit slave owners. Because this is a question of equality and property. If you're a slave owner in South Carolina and you bought your slaves and then you moved to, say, California, which is a free state, you could keep your slaves. Even though slavery was illegal in California, you can keep your slaves because they're your property. Plessy versus Ferguson, this is a Supreme Court case. I say know it well, because you can use this for an essay on Supreme Court cases, or you could use this as a civil rights issue. So Plessy refuses to sit in the Jim Crow car on the train. He's part black. He's arrested. He sues. In the end, the Supreme Court rules separate but equal is fine. The federal government upholds racial segregation in the country for public facilities. Segregation is justified as long as it's equal. But as we know, accommodations for blacks in America were never equal to the accommodations that would be given to whites. And this will stand until Brown versus Board of Education overturns this case. Schenck versus the U.S., this is World War I, is a question of civil liberties. Charles Schenck is a socialist. He's arrested for spreading pamphlets encouraging people to dodge the draft. They said this violates the Espionage Act because he is undermining the war effort. The Supreme Court rules in times of war, the federal government has the ability to limit liberties of American citizens. This includes free speech. They felt that this established a clear and present danger, even if the speech wasn't considered, so in times of speech or in times of peace, because we're at war. It's a threat to the war effort. It's a threat to the United States national security. So often you'll see Schenck versus the U.S., you'll see limits freedom of speech, and you'll see clear and present danger as a multiple choice option. There's a number of other cases you might see. There's one, Poultry versus the U.S., and this has to do with the New Deal. If you understand that the New Deal wasn't fully supported and the Supreme Court deems a number of them unconstitutional, you'll be fine on a multiple choice question on that. Another key case, Korematsu versus U.S. This is World War II. It's about civil liberties, rights of the minority groups. Fred Korematsu sued the government because they put him in an internment camp because he was of Japanese descent. He felt his rights were being violated. Supreme Court rules that in times of war, taking away rights was completely justified. This is similar again to Lincoln and his suspension of habeas corpus, or Wilson and Schenck versus the U.S., or President Bush and the Patriot Act. Rights can and have been limited in times of war. That's a good one for Supreme Court cases or even presidential actions. Brown versus Board of Education, again, know this well because it goes with Plessy. You can use this for civil rights or a Supreme Court case. Linda Brown had to be bused 2 hours away. Her father sued on her behalf to get her to be able to go to a white school. Earl Warren, the justice at this time, has a number of progressive rulings on civil rights, and he says, hey, separate is inherently unequal. This reverses Plessy versus Ferguson. Educational facilities that are separate are inherently unequal. He calls for an end to segregation. Schools should be desegregated immediately, but it does take some time. The next couple of cases are kind of lumped together. Mapp versus Ohio, Gideon versus Wainwright, Miranda versus Arizona. These are all about civil liberties and the rights of the accused. It protects people accused of crimes. Anything that is found illegally without a search warrant cannot be used against you, so it protects you from unlawful search and seizure of your property. Also, you are entitled to a lawyer. If you can't afford one, one will be provided for you. And then, of course, if you don't know you have these rights to a lawyer or a right to remain silent, that's the Fifth Amendment, you don't have to incriminate yourself, then you have to be told these rights. And those are the Miranda rights. All of those cases have to do with protections for people accused of crimes. So, when you are Mirandaized or given your Miranda rights, you're given this formal warning that you have the right to remain silent. You have a right to an attorney, and if you can't afford one will be given to you. Has to be done, or cases can be thrown out. Engel versus Vitale is a case about school-sponsored prayer. Schools cannot sponsor a prayer. Teachers can't sponsor a prayer. It's the rights of students that we're not trying to indoctrinate you into a certain religion. But if you want to pray as an individual or a small group of students, you can do that. Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the United States. Again, this is a question about equality. Heart Atlanta Motel refused to serve Black people at their hotel. They wanted to keep it segregated. They argued that it was the right of business. But the court rules that Congress regulates business. This is that interstate, trade. And you can't decide who you serve and who you don't serve. You can't discriminate based on the color of skin or gender, or any of that. So even if you have a local business, because people are coming out of the state and staying there, this hotel, it falls under interstate kind of rules. Tinker versus Des Moines, another Supreme Court case about students. Students protested the Vietnam War by wearing armbands with peace signs on them. The school expelled them. Students sue. And the Supreme Court rules that schools cannot limit students' freedom of speech in regards to clothing, which allows them to express their freedom of speech. But we can put some restrictions. Again, if it's violent or inappropriate for a school setting, you can be prevented from wearing them. But if you want to wear an anti-war message, provided it meets certain school guidelines, you are protected. It's a right of the students to do that. New York Times Company versus the United States. This protects freedom of the press. So this has to do with the Pentagon Papers during Vietnam War. Basically, these papers were given to the New York Times. They had planned to publish them, and the federal government sued to try to block publication. But ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled that the media does have a power against government secrecy. This protects freedom of press. The court lifted and allowed these papers to go to press, which kind of showed that there was decisions made about the Vietnam War without the public knowledge that kind of upset them. But if you remember, New York Times protects freedom of the press. The other freedom of the press case that you might kind of hear about is the Peter Zenger trial. That's a colonial issue that leads to this creation in the Bill of Rights of the freedom of the press. Roe versus Wade, this expands women's rights. It gives them freedom to control their own bodies and make medical decisions. It has to do with a Texas law that criminalized abortion. United States versus Nixon, again, this has to do with Watergate. It maintains checks and balances. It's linked to the Watergate scandal. It confirms that the executive privilege does exist, but it also limits that power. And it proves that checks and balances does work out and that the president is not above the law. New Jersey versus TLO has to do with students' rights. This girl is caught smoking in the bathroom. When they searched her bag, they found that she also had marijuana, and she was brought to a police station. They argued that searching her bag is a violation of her Fourth Amendment right. In the end, the court decided that schools don't necessarily have to follow the same rules as police officers and get a search warrant because schools are responsible for our safety. So as long as there's reasonable grounds for suspecting that a search would turn up evidence, schools can complete a search. So since she was caught smoking, the schools were reasonable in suspecting that she might have had cigarettes, and so they could search her bag, and this led to other information. So this has to do with rights of students, but it shows that your rights aren't absolute and that schools have a responsibility to protect everyone. Therefore, they need to be able to have like swift and informal disciplinary procedures, which would lead to them be able to search your bags or lockers or even cars. Those are some of the key cases. This does match up to the document posted in Google Classroom. So hopefully that kind of sums it up. I know it's a lot of information, but maybe just hearing this again can help you. In Google Classroom, with the first video I posted yesterday, I did post my notes that I kind of used to outline. Not everything here was discussed by me. I focused just kind of on those big ideas and key concepts that pop up the most. If you think about anything that kind of comes up, I'm going to try to come in early tomorrow, and I can try to respond to some of the questions that you post either in Google Classroom or maybe on the YouTube video. Again, I'll post a link for you guys, but HipHugh's History will have a live review tonight for the U.S. regions at 8 o'clock. I hope this helped. I hope I wasn't too quick, and I hope that you don't hold it against me that it took me a while to get this working. Hopefully this goes a little bit more smoothly. Best of luck. Be here 7:45. Make sure you bring your dark blue or black pens, and breathe. You've been studying for this all year. You guys been productive. You've got it.